Listen, yesterday, so how, did we get through all of worms yesterday?
No.
All right, so we are going to pick up, even if we did some of this, we're going to start with worms and we'll talk about the other invertebrate phyla today. And then, like I said, I'm going to show you a couple things that are kind of neat to look at. So we look at where we are. Domain, eukarya. Kingdom, animal. That's what all this stuff we're talking about. Then phylum, we've mentioned a couple so far. So yesterday, we mentioned the phylum Porifera, the sponges. We mentioned phylum Cnidarium, which are the jellyfish and the ones with stinging cells. We talked about phylum Echinoderm, spiny skin, the sea stars and sea urchins, things like that. So today we're going to talk about a few more of these phyla. Kind of a question?
How many phylums are there?
There's a lot of them. I don't know the exact number. Some only have a couple little things in them. We're talking about sort of some of the bigger phyla that are in the animal kingdom. So, kind of?
Are all the phylums that we talked about so far invertebrates?
Yeah, all the ones we talked about so far are invertebrates, yes. All right, so let's talk a little bit about worms. Worms are actually 3 different phyla. We're just lumping them together on this slide, but they include segmented worms, okay, flatworms, and roundworms. So this is a segmented worm that we're all probably familiar with. That is an earthworm. And earthworms are extremely valuable to the soil. What do earthworms do that's helpful to the soil? Penda? Yeah, as they are burrowing through the soil, they consume the soil, and the little bits of organic matter, leaves and dead animals and dead plant material, they digest it, and in their waste, the nutrients are returned back to the soil, so they sort of help fertilize the soil. Okay? Another segmented worm related to an earthworm, and do you know what earthworm excrement looks like? Their poop. You probably have seen it. So if you see on top, if you ever been like outside and there's some like bare soil, and you see little clusters of like round, it looks like just dirt. And you could pick it up and you smush it. You could throw it at your friends probably. These little piles are actually earthworm. They're called castings, and they're actually the waste of an earthworm. You probably just thought they were little clumps of dirt, but they're actually earthworm castings. So related to an earthworm, another segmented worm is a leech. And so a leech is, you could see the segments in its body. Leeches are parasitic segmented worms. And leeches feed on what?
Blood.
They feed on blood. This part of the leech right here is the sucker. The wider end, that's not where it feeds. That just holds it on to an animal. The smaller pointy end is like the head end of the leech. That's the part that will bite the animal. Okay? Leeches in nature they live in the water. They feed on lots of different types of animals. Some might attach to frogs or salamanders or fish or birds or mammals. And they attach and then they look for an area. The head end probes around until it finds like a soft area, and then they bite the animal. In their saliva, they have special chemicals that do a couple things. First, they make it so the bite doesn't really hurt. Because if it hurt, the animal would know the leech is there and try to remove it probably. Also in their saliva, they have an anticoagulant, a substance that prevents the blood from clotting. So when they bite an animal, this chemical will prevent their blood from clotting so that leech can just take in that blood. And basically they fill up with blood, and then once they're full, they'll release themselves, sink down to the bottom of the water, and digest that blood. And that's their source of food. That's their source of energy. They live all over the place in fresh water. Have you ever seen the movie Stand By Me?
Yeah.
Like old 1980s movie?
Yeah.
It's based on a Stephen King story. In that movie, there's a scene when the kids go in like a swimming, and then they have a bunch of leeches on them when they come out. Abby?
Wait,
what do leeches do for people? Don't they like?
Well, I mean, for a person, you might, if you were like just in some random pond or something, a leech might attach to you. It might
No, it doesn't like cure.
Oh, we're going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about it right now. Next week, we're going to take a day and talk about 2 invertebrates. One is leeches, which are used in medicine. So we'll talk about that, but I'm not going to talk about it right now. Devin?
Does it like hurt if you get?
Yeah, it might hurt. You would feel it, but you would just like take it off right away. You would probably know it's there. So they don't really feed on people, usually.
Like besides it taking your blood, would it actually like do anything else? Like give you like a disease?
No, no. All right, so those are leeches. So some worms are free, like the earthworms. Some are parasites. This is one we're going to look at next week. This is a flatworm. It's called the Planaria. And the Planaria we're going to look at under the dissecting microscope. They're pretty small. They're a few, several millimeters long. But what's interesting about Planaria is if you cut a Planaria in half, each half will grow into a whole new Planaria. So they have this ability to regenerate. This is the heart of a dog that died from this worm infection. You know what the name of this worm is?
Oh, I know. Guinea worm?
No.
No.
If you have a dog at home, you may give your dog every 3 months a
Yeah,
little.
It's
It looks like a treat.
it's I forget.
What's the medicine called?
Usually puppies.
It's called HeartGuard is the medicine. These are heartworms. And heartworms can affect dogs. What it is, it's a parasitic worm that your dog can contract. And this worm goes into the dog's circulatory system. Eventually makes its way into the heart. And it basically lives off of the blood of the dog. Okay? And as it lives off the blood, it grows bigger. It reproduces. And so it can become so numerous. All of this white stuff are worms. In this case, it's completely clogged up the dog's heart, and it can't pump anymore, and it killed the dog. Okay? So the reason you give your dog those HeartGuard medicine every few months is to prevent this worm from affecting them. But that's heartworm. There's lots of parasitic worms. Some affect humans, some affect other animals. Matt?
Wait, I was thinking, I might have been thinking of a different one, but puppies usually get, like, is that the one that puppies usually get?
Yeah, so I'll tell you 2 stories about my dogs. The first is when I first got a dog, this was a long time ago, I took her out in the backyard to go to the bathroom, and she went to the bathroom and left me a little brown gift there. And when I was looking, though, at where she left, on top I saw a little tiny, about the size of a grain of rice, a little tiny white thing wiggling around. And so when I saw that, I knew that she had a tapeworm. Okay? Tapeworms they live in usually the digestive system of an animal. Some can affect humans, some affect other animals. And tapeworms live in like the small intestine. And as the animal eats food, the tapeworm absorbs nutrients from that food. So it doesn't have to find its own food. It's just taking away from whatever the animal's eating, whatever my dog was eating. And the problem is that as that tapeworm gets larger and reproduces, it takes more and more of the nutrients that the animal's eating. And so it can kind of starve the animal of nutrients. Even though the animal may eat a lot, the worms may be getting a lot of that nutrition. Also, it can build up and clog the intestine of the animal. So that's my first story. Second story, so for that one, so when I knew my dog had tapeworm, just called the vet. They give a single pill, and you give it to your dog, and it kills the worms. So it's no big deal. It's when you don't know it's there, it could become a problem. And the other stories are, so after we had that dog, we got another dog, and we got her very young. You know, usually it's about 8 to 10 weeks when like a breeder will give you a dog. But we got ours young for some reason. She was like 6 weeks old. And so when most puppies are born, right around the time they're born or soon afterwards, they usually get infected with worms. Okay? Intestinal worms like I was just talking about. And almost all dogs get this. And before they actually give them to somebody to take home, they usually give them a deworming medication. But because we got our dog so early, she hadn't had the deworming yet. So we had to give it to her. We got her young, so we gave her, again, it was just, I think, one pill, and it kills the worms inside of the dog. But I didn't realize the extent of how many worms there are, because after we gave her this pill, I wasn't expecting this, for, at least, 36 or 48 hours. When she went to the bathroom, it looked like it was a plate of spaghetti that had come out. It was just worm after worm. Some of them were longer than her whole body. Some of these worms is really kind of gross. But it's just common. Usually they do that, give your dog that medicine before you get it when a dog is young. Geb?
How do pills dissolve in your body?
They just break down in like your stomach acid and stuff, and then they go through your digestive system. Your blood absorbs medicines and circulates. That's why, like, you could take Advil if you have a headache. It goes in through your, just like nutrients, goes through all your blood, reaches, the blood cells in your brain, and helps reduce swelling and stuff. Kendall?
How do worms get inside the body?
They usually get them. They might get them during birth from their mother or in their environment, but they almost all dogs get infected with worms early on. Some parasites affect humans as well. This is a picture of somebody's foot.
Oh.
This is a person's foot. You can see their toes down here. That's their foot. This is their calf and their upper leg. This is a person that has elephantiasis, it's called. And it's caused by a worm that can get into a person. If they're walking around an area where these worms are common, it could get in through their skin. It goes into what's called their lymphatic system. Our lymphatic system moves fluid around our body. And this worm can clog up the lymphatic system so that the fluid in a person's body can't get back into circulation, so it starts to collect in their lower extremities. So their feet start to swell up and their calves swell up. This is not the worst case, though. I mean, I've seen pictures, and when we talk about human body, I'll show you some others, that their limbs swell up, even their whole upper leg, to huge, huge proportions because of this infection with this worm. So there are lots of parasites that affect humans as well as animals.
Do they get into cuts? If you have a cut on your
Not really cut. Sometimes it's in the soil or the water, and as they're walking around, the worm can get into their body. This is another flatworm, but this is not a parasitic. This is a free-living flatworm. It's called a fluke. They have really bright colors. They live in the oceans. They swim with this interesting motion. They're just kind of neat-looking creatures. And we're going to watch these videos. We're going to talk more about leeches and leech therapy next week. So we'll get to that. Phylum Mollusca, the mollusks. This is one you're probably mostly familiar with because you probably have eaten a lot of these invertebrates before. Mollusks have soft bodies, but often covered in a hard shell. Okay? So some examples of mollusks: slugs, octopus. Some people eat octopus. Squid, which lots of people eat.
What about scallops?
Scallops are mollusks. Clams, oysters, mussels. All of those things are in this phylum, mollusks. Many of them are filter feeders. So clams, mussels, oysters, they are filter feeders. So they suck water in from the ocean or from the lakes that they live in and filter out little tiny bits of food from it. So those are mollusks. And they can move. Some people think like clams and stuff just like stay on the bottom of the ocean and don't move. They move around. They can burrow into the sand. They can squirt water out of their siphon and sort of swim around in the water. So they can move around, and also includes things like snails. So a slug is basically a snail with no shell. This is a nautilus. They make those like spiral shells that you sometimes see, and they secrete those. But these shelled animals, they make that shell. It's like a part of their body. So some people confuse, like, because a hermit crab, does a hermit crab make its shell? No, it just crawls into a shell left over from another animal and sort of lives in there. It's more like their house. These shells are their actual part of their body that they make. So mollusks are another type of invertebrate. And we're going to watch a video today that shows octopus have a really amazing ability to camouflage and disguise themselves, so they're almost invisible at certain times. Kendall?
Will like a crab or a lobster be
No, we're going to get to them next. Oh, and that's a conch. You ever heard of conch shell, those big shells you see? There's a mollusk that lives in there when they're alive. You know, and then when the animals die inside of them, what's left are what we call seashells that you gather up. They're from mollusks. That the animal has died, but the shell is durable and stays around and washes up on the shore. Matt?
In Florida, my family was walking on the beach and we found a conch shell in the water near my brother, and there was like something living inside of it. But it looked sort of like it was closed in and it was breathing.
Oh, yeah.
We didn't know what it was. So
Yes.
we just left it there.
It's probably that. It's probably the actual conch. People eat conch too. You can eat it. All right, our last phylum are arthropods. It's a huge, huge phylum. The name itself, do you remember when we said pseudopod, when we talked about the amoeba? What did the pod part mean? Like a podiatrist? Pod? Yeah, it means feet. The pod part means feet. An arthropod, arthro means jointed feet. Arthropods have a hard outer covering called an exoskeleton. Where is our skeleton? Inside. It's an endoskeleton. But arthropods have a skeleton on the outside, a sort of hard shell that they make. Their body's broken into segments, sections. They have bilateral symmetry. And actually about 75% of all animals are in this group, arthropods. So the vast majority of animals are actually arthropods. And so when we say jointed feet, what we mean is that their exoskeleton, if you imagine like a suit of armor, like would it be good to have a suit of armor and the legs are just two straight metal tubes and your arms are two metal tubes?
No.
Or obviously you just have to walk around like this. You can bend at your elbows or your wrists or anything. But an actual suit of armor has joints, sections between the two sections that are bendable so that you can move inside of it. Well, the same sort of thing is true of arthropods. This exoskeleton has joints between the parts that bend. And these include, so in our kingdom, our domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia, phylum Arthropoda, there are several classes of arthropods, different groups. And you're familiar with a lot of these, okay? And they include arachnids, which are what? Spiders. Arachnids have 8 legs and 2 body sections. Insects. Insects have 6 legs and 3 body sections. What's an example of an insect? A fly, a beetle, an ant, butterfly. Those are all insects. Insects are the largest group. Crustaceans. They have 10 legs. What are some examples of crustaceans? No, an octopus was a mollusk. Crab, lobster, shrimp. Okay, those are all crustaceans. Just gotta count them up.
One's like long.
And then it includes centipedes and millipedes. Centipedes are usually carnivorous. They eat insects and things. And they have 1 pair of legs on each body section. Millipedes have 2 pairs of legs on each body section. They're usually herbivores, vegetarians. All right, we'll come back to that in a minute. I have 2 slides I want to show you. So these arthropods, because they have this hard exoskeleton, that sort of poses a little bit of a problem because they can't grow larger. They have this hard outer shell, and it's basically a certain size, and it can't grow any larger. And so when an arthropod does need to get bigger, you know what it has to do? Kind of? It has to shed its shell. We call that molting. Okay? One form of this is called incomplete metamorphosis. It's when the body of the animal changes. This grasshopper is an example of incomplete metamorphosis. Starting at the egg hatches into a small grasshopper called a nymph. And then, to grow larger, that grasshopper, to go to a larger nymph and eventually an adult, it has to break out of its exoskeleton. That process is called molting. I don't know if you ever noticed, but up here I have this little exoskeleton from a little beetle. I used to find these in our backyard. We used to have a wooden swing set. We would always find attached to that wooden swing set what looked like insects attached to it. My daughters would always freak out. But there actually was no living insect there. What there was just the remaining exoskeleton. I brought one of in. Because what would happen when these beetles are going to grow larger, they basically go find a surface they can hold on to tightly, and then they break out of the back of their exoskeleton and move away, and then they're larger and they can grow a new, larger exoskeleton. But left over is that little shell that's left behind. So that's what that is. And I'll show you a video of that in a second. It's really cool. But let me just talk about this as our last thing. So the other type of metamorphosis is called complete metamorphosis. This is when an egg hatches into a larval stage, which actually looks quite different from the adult stage. The larva's main job is to eat as much food as possible, to store up enough energy to build a pupa, to go into the pupa stage. And then emerging from that pupa is the adult stage. And the adult and larva often look completely different from each other. Like if you think a caterpillar metamorphizing into a butterfly, they're the same organism, just different stages. Or a maggot metamorphizing into a fly is another example of complete metamorphosis. All right, this video shows a crab. It's a spider crab from an aquarium. And it shows it molting from its shell. It's kind of neat to see. Yeah, it's time lapse, but it's not like super sped up. I mean, it does happen more slowly than the video appears, but you can see this crab just sort of walking around in the aquarium, getting little bits of food, eating. But for this crab, it's basically outgrown its exoskeleton. And in order to grow larger, it needs to shed it and grow a new one. And so you'll see as this video goes along how the crab basically comes out of that exoskeleton. You can see the softer parts here. That's the part that is inside of the shell.
Do we have any homework?
SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs has to
So you can see now he slows down. Now he's starting to pull out of that exoskeleton.
It looks like swords, right?
Oh my god! Oh, it turned around.
Whoa. Whoa, that's
Oh.
cool.
So it pulls all of its legs out of that exoskeleton.
Oh, I thought it was just like that top part.
No, the whole thing. And so you'll notice also the color obviously is different. Now, right now, this crab is vulnerable to predators because it hasn't formed a new exoskeleton. So this is a soft-shelled crab, if you ever heard of that. Yeah, well, you could eat a hard-shelled crab. You have to break open the shell and get it. But they do sell sometimes soft-shelled crab where if they get a crab in this stage, it's soft and it hasn't formed a new exoskeleton yet. So, but during this time, like I said, they're vulnerable to predators because they don't have that protective exoskeleton anymore. Not really. It just sort of sits here now for a little while.
How long did it take again?
Not that long. I mean, a few days until a new shell probably forms. But again, it already, as it pulls out, it's larger than its previous exoskeleton.
How many times does this like go through?
And every time it's going to grow larger, that's when that happens. All right. So I do have another video I'll show you for a few minutes.